The Clash Royale meta in September is absolutely crazy, and with the global tournament going on, here are the top 5 decks to play in Clash Royale in the month of September. Let's get right into it. Number 1. Mortar Hog Cycle. Now, for the first time in a while, Mortar is actually one of the top decks in this current Clash Royale meta, specifically this deck with the Hog Rider and the Mighty Miner. Now, this is a chip style of cycle deck, meaning that throughout the match, you're going to be slowly but surely getting a Mortar hit, a Hog hit, or an Earthquake on the tower over and over again. This is generally going to be a pretty fast deck, so starting off the match, I'm always going to be cycling some of my skeletons or logs, or I'll even go in with a Hog or a Mortar at the bridge at the very first play. I like getting the match started and keeping my opponents on their toes because that's sort of the advantage of a cycle deck, right? You have a faster cycle, but you need to make sure that your opponent cannot build up those massive offensive pushes. So on offense, your pushes are quite simple. You have your Mortar, which you're trying to connect onto the tower, and you have the Hog Rider, which you're going to be trying to cycle as quickly as possible to outcycle your opponent's Hog counters. Lastly, you also have the Earthquake and the Log, which are just great support spells to take care of the opponent's buildings. On the defensive side of this deck, the Musketeer and the Mighty Miner are going to be your main defensive powerhouses. Mighty Miner is usually going to be used against big tanks such as the Mega Knight and the Golem, while the Musketeer is more useful against air units as well as offensive cards such as the Electro Giant. Lastly, you also have the Mortar, which is useful to pull any sort of building targeting units. This is what makes this deck so effective. You get to switch between playing a Mortar cycle deck and a Hog cycle deck. Lastly, with the Mighty Miner being so tanky and the Musketeer having such a long range, you'll very likely have surviving units on a counter push. If you do, just be very careful about giving your opponents too much spell value. If you play a Mortar down, you may give your opponents a free fireball, and if you play a Hog Rider down, then something like a Mega Knight will just get way too much value. So just be a little bit careful about that. All in all, a fast and fun deck to pick up and play. Number 2. Giant Skeleton Bait. Now, this deck is absolutely crazy. I mean, if you told me that a deck looking like this was gonna be meta a couple of months ago, I would have been like, bro, are you out of your mind? But this deck is actually so good. It is a bait style deck centered around mirroring the Goblin Barrel and getting those connections onto the tower. Starting things off, I'm generally going to play pretty reactively. I will definitely go in with Goblin Barrel or cycle my Skeleton Army in the back, but generally the deck composition is very control based. You're trying to build up an elixir advantage by controlling the defense of this match and turning that into an offensive push. So starting off on the defense, Sparky and Hunter deal with your high output damage. Hunter is also useful for air, and then you have your Skeleton King and your Giant Skeleton as sort of your tank units. As usual, it's very important that you are constantly protecting your Sparky as well as your Hunter so that they get as much value as possible. The Skeleton Army is also insanely useful because not only does it feed the ability of the Skeleton King, but you can also mirror it on defense, creating so much utility on the defensive end. On offense, most of the time my offense is just going to be sending a barrel and then mirroring it, but if you have a surviving counter push, which you very often do, it's also nice to go in with a counter push as well. If you're able to get some sort of tank for the barrel, then the push is going to be even more deadly. Perhaps in the best case scenario, you can even get a Skeleton King ability saved up for you to play on offense as well. The opponent only has so much splash defense and small spells, so if you're just able to completely overwhelm your opponent, they're going to be in a very difficult position where they have to really be smart in choosing when to use their spells. One last warning though, this deck does not have a big spell, so just make sure that you take down the opponent's tower before you move on to the next one. Number 3. Lava Hound Clone. Lava Hound Clone is, in my opinion, the best Lava Hound variation in this meta because certain spells such as the Poison and the Tornado simply are not as popular, so Clone absolutely shines in these scenarios. Starting off like most Lava Hound decks, this is an extremely aggressive composition, so starting off the match, I'm never afraid to just go in with a Lava Hound and immediately start building an offensive push onto your opponent's tower. Make sure that the Lava Hound stays in front, and then I'll generally support the Lava Hound with just a single support unit at the very beginning. This is to avoid giving your opponents too much spell value. Then you'll have Elixir to either spam the rest of your air units or use something such as a Fireball or a Clone to take down down the opponent's counters. Generally, the Lumberjack and the Skeleton Army I will save for defensive purposes since we don't really have that many ground units, so just be very wary if you want to use one of those cards on offense. On defense is when things can get a little bit iffy. Your opponents are going to try to rush the opposite lane, and in those cases it's very important that you play this really smart. First off, you have the Lumberjack and the Skeleton Army. These are your two ground units, so make sure that you save them for defense. The main ideology behind this deck's defense is you're using these ground units to tank for your air units. The air units, such as the Flying Machine, the Bats, and the Baby Dragon, will be doing a big chunk of damage on defense as well. However, it may also be important to note that in some cases, if the opponent just has a gigantic push down the opposite lane, you may as well just make sure you don't get 3 crown and also push in the opposite lane and just go straight up for a tower trade. This deck works extremely well no matter what the tower situation is, so going into a 2-tower game is definitely something that is an advantage for you. All in all, an extremely fast-paced and fun deck to play, definitely a top choice for me. Number 4, Royal Hogs Mirror. Now this is another giant skeleton deck that has just absolutely taken over this meta. The whole goal of this deck is you are just so solid on defense that your Hog Riders are just going to slowly but surely chip down the opponent's crown towers. So starting off the match, I'm generally pretty passive. I mean, if the opponent really isn't playing anything, then I'll cycle some of my cards in the back or even split Royal Hogs at the bridge. But again, the whole point of this deck is that you are just rock solid on defense. The reason is because you have so many troops that can stall the opponent's push, specifically the Zappies and the Fishermen. Both of these cards are really good at slowing down the opponent's pushes and buying your other defensive units time to damage them down. Aside from that, you have very great area denial with the Mother Witch as well as the Royal Ghost, and the Giant Skeleton will be your main tank as well as your main lane clogger. In terms of offense, well, things are pretty simple as well. Of course, you can go in with the Royal Hogs to either split at the bridge or all in a single lane depending on what splash units your opponents have in cycle, and you can also place Hogs down with a surviving counter push. This is extremely deadly if you have a surviving Giant Skeleton down one lane and you go ahead and split your Hogs in the center. Very difficult for your opponents to stop completely. If you're able to absolutely hold down the defense, the Royal Hogs are just going to slowly but surely chip away a couple hundred damage every single push. Number 5, Splash Yard Control. Graveyard is not exactly one of the most popular decks in the meta anymore. However, Splash Yard is still extremely strong and is definitely something that you cannot underestimate. As with most graveyard decks, this is a heavily control-based deck, with the whole entire idea being you're making positive trades on defense and converting those into an offensive graveyard push. Starting off the match, I will be extremely reactive and defend the opponent's initial pushes. The defense of this deck is extremely solid because there's so many troops that can stall the opponent's push, with the Ice Wizard very clearly slowing down the opponent's troops and the Tombstone Skeletons also providing a lot of distraction as well. Aside from that, you also have the Baby Dragon and the Skeleton King on defense, and if you'll notice, all of these units are splash units, meaning that combining these units alongside of a Tornado is going to be extremely effective at grouping those units together to allow your troops to get more value. It is also extremely important that you use defensive poisons as well, especially against air decks such as Lava Hound and Balloon. The defensive poison can slow down your opponent's balloon and stop any sort of clone action from the opponent. When it comes to the offense of this deck, well, you really have two main options. The first is a quick bridge graveyard push. This is usually useful if your opponent makes a bigger commitment in the opposite lane. Then you can just go ahead and play down the graveyard and then tank for it a little bit with a Barbarian Barrel or a Baby Dragon at the bridge. You can also build pushes off of a surviving counter push. Most likely you'll have a surviving Skeleton King or a Baby Dragon. Make sure you have these units tanking for your graveyard. Tornado and Poison are two extremely helpful units when it comes to allowing your graveyards to get more value. You can Tornado units away from the graveyard or you can poison them out, but just be very careful to not overcommit because it's very easy to just spend all of your elixir on a graveyard push and not be able to defend the opponent's counter push. All in all, if the mindset that you have playing this deck is defensive, then you're going to be on the right path.